The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Dr. Regina Washington's home office, casting warm stripes across her desk. She sat there, reading the email for what felt like the 100th time, her heart still skipping a beat at the words "appointed as Chief of Police, Millbrook County." 20 years of hard work had led to this moment, and she could hardly believe it was real. Taking a sip from her favorite coffee mug, a gift from her grandmother with the words "Dream Big" written in faded letters, Regina reflected on her journey. She'd started as a rookie officer, walking the beat in the roughest neighborhoods, earning the community's trust one conversation at a time. While other officers headed home after their shifts, she'd stayed up late studying for her master's degree, then her doctorate in criminal justice. Her dissertation on community-oriented policing had earned recognition nationwide, but she'd never forgotten her roots. Regina glanced at the family photos lining her wall. There was one of her father, who'd worked as a janitor at the local police station, unknowingly planting the seeds of her future career. Next to it hung a picture of her mother, a schoolteacher who'd taught her that education was the key to breaking barriers. They hadn't lived to see this day, but she could almost hear their proud voices. Opening her laptop, she began researching her new department. Millbrook County was a mid-sized force with a decent reputation, but like many departments, it struggled with community relations and trust issues. The statistics showed a clear pattern of disproportionate traffic stops in certain neighborhoods. Regina's fingers drummed thoughtfully on her desk as an idea began to form. She picked up her phone and called her mentor, retired Chief Anderson. "I'm thinking of doing something unconventional," she said, explaining her plan to observe the department undercover before officially starting her role. "You always did have a knack for thinking outside the box," Anderson chuckled. "Just be careful. First impressions matter, especially in your position." After hanging up, Regina walked to her closet and pulled out a simple blue blazer and matching slacks, professional but not flashy. She'd wear this tomorrow instead of her usual power suits. Her official start date wasn't for another week, but she wanted to get a real feel for her department, unfiltered and honest. That evening, as she prepared dinner in her kitchen, Regina thought about the challenges ahead. She knew some officers might resist having a black woman as their chief. Others might expect her to be either too harsh or too lenient. But she hadn't come this far by worrying about others' expectations. She sat at her dining table, enjoying her meal while reviewing the department's policy manual on her tablet. The house felt quiet, but her mind was buzzing with ideas. Community outreach programs, bias training reforms, transparency initiatives. She had big plans. But first, she needed to understand the real culture of her department, not just what showed up in official reports. Regina walked to her window, looking out at the peaceful suburban street she called home. Tomorrow, she would drive through a similar neighborhood, but under very different circumstances. She smiled, knowing that sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected moments. Setting her alarm for early morning, Regina tucked away her acceptance email in a special folder. Tomorrow would be interesting, to say the least. She didn't plan to start her tenure with confrontation, but if her suspicions about traffic stop patterns were correct, she might just get an eye-opening demonstration of exactly what needed to change in her department. As she got ready for bed, Regina remembered something her mother used to say. Sometimes you have to experience the problem to understand the solution. Tomorrow, she would put that wisdom to the test. Not as Chief Washington, not as Dr. Washington, but simply as another citizen of Millbrook County. And whatever happened would set the tone for the changes she hoped to bring. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders, not as a burden but as a familiar companion. She'd carried it throughout her career, through every promotion, every challenge, and every victory. Tomorrow would be another step in that journey, perhaps one of the most important ones yet. Dawn broke over Millbrook County as Regina pulled her navy blue Honda Civic out of the garage. She'd chosen this car deliberately. It was clean but understated, the kind that wouldn't draw attention in any neighborhood. As she adjusted her rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of herself and smiled. Today, she wore minimal makeup and had pulled her hair back in a simple style, looking more like an office worker than a police chief. The morning traffic was light as she drove past familiar landmarks. The local coffee shop where she usually grabbed her morning brew, the park where elderly couples took their early walks, the elementary school with its crossing guards already at their posts. But today, she turned onto Oak Hill Road, heading into the affluent Highland District instead of taking her usual route downtown. Regina knew this area well, though not from living there. During her years as a detective, she'd noticed a pattern in traffic stop reports from this neighborhood. Young officers seemed particularly zealous about pulling over any drivers who they thought didn't belong. She'd tried addressing it then, but as a detective, her influence had been limited. Her hands rested steady on the steering wheel as she drove exactly 3 miles under the speed limit. The houses here were grand affairs set back from the street, with perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars in circular driveways. A jogger waved at a passing neighbor, and sprinklers created rainbow arcs in the morning light. Regina checked her watch, 7:45 a.m. Shift change had just happened at the station. The morning patrol officers would be fresh on duty, eager to make their mark on the day. She'd reviewed their patrol patterns last night. She knew at least 2 units regularly covered this area during morning hours. As she drove, Regina's mind wandered to her first days as a patrol officer. She remembered the adrenaline, the desire to prove herself, the way every vehicle could seem suspicious if you looked hard enough. But she'd also remembered her father's stories about being pulled over 3 times in 1 week just for driving to his night shift job. A child waited at a bus stop, clutching his mother's hand. Regina slowed down appropriately, using her turn signal well in advance, perfect driving etiquette. Through her open window, she could hear birds singing and lawnmowers humming. It was a beautiful morning in an exclusive neighborhood, and she was about to turn it into a teaching moment. She glanced at her phone, secured in its dashboard mount. It was set to record, not because she planned to shame anyone, but because documentation was crucial for training. Whatever happened next would become part of her larger plan for departmental reform. Regina thought about the email she'd drafted last night, sitting unopened in her outbox. It announced her arrival to the department, scheduled to be sent automatically in an hour. By then, she hoped to have first-hand experience of what some community members face daily. The houses grew larger, the lawns more expensive. She turned onto Maple Drive, known among officers as the Loop, a favorite spot for catching speeders and writing tickets. Her pulse remained steady. After 20 years in law enforcement, she'd developed nerves of steel, but this morning felt different. She wasn't here as law enforcement. She was here as a citizen, about to experience what too many others had. Through her mirror, she spotted what she'd been expecting: a patrol car pulling out from a side street. They weren't following her yet, but she knew they'd noticed her vehicle. Regina took a slow, deep breath. Everything she did next would be by the book, giving them no legitimate reason for a stop. Yet, based on her department's statistics, she suspected that wouldn't matter. The morning sun caught her rearview mirror, momentarily blinding her. She adjusted it carefully, using the motion to check the patrol car's position again. They were definitely closer now. Regina turned down the soft jazz playing on her radio, preparing for what was coming. As a cop, she'd initiated countless traffic stops. As a black woman in law enforcement, she'd experienced them from the other side too. But today would be different. Today would mark the beginning of real change in Millbrook County. The weight of her badge, currently tucked away in her purse, seemed to grow heavier. She hadn't earned that badge to perpetuate a broken system, but to fix it. Sometimes, she thought, the best way to lead is to first understand exactly what needs to be changed. The flash of red and blue lights in Regina's rearview mirror wasn't unexpected, but her heart still skipped a beat. She'd been driving perfectly, exactly 2 miles under the speed limit, both hands visible on the wheel, all traffic laws followed to the letter. Taking a deep breath, she slowly pulled over to the right side of the pristine suburban street, positioning her car precisely as she'd trained countless officers to do during traffic stops. The crunch of gravel under tires told her the patrol car had stopped behind her. Regina's trained eye caught the tactical positioning in her mirrors, slightly offset from her vehicle, angled for safety. She had to admit, at least their basic protocol was sound. Her fingers remained steady at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel as she watched Officer Thompson approach from the driver's side while Officer Martinez took the passenger side position. The morning sun caught Thompson's badge as he approached, casting a brief glare through her window. He was young, probably no more than 2 years out of the academy, with the straight-backed confidence of someone still eager to prove themselves. Regina recognized that walk, She'd had it herself, once upon a time. A tap on her window with a flashlight, firm but not aggressive. Regina pressed the button to lower her window, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. The scent of freshly cut grass from nearby lawns mixed with the leather polish from Thompson's utility belt as he leaned slightly toward her window. "License and registration, ma'am," Thompson said, his tone clipped and professional, but with an underlying edge that Regina had heard too many times before. She noticed how his hand rested near his hip, not on his weapon, but close enough to reach it quickly. Standard procedure, but in this context, it made a statement. "Of course, officer," Regina replied, her voice steady and clear. "My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now." She narrated her movements just as she'd taught her officers to appreciate when conducting stops. The irony wasn't lost on her. Officer Martinez shifted his weight at the passenger window, his reflection catching in her side mirror. He was scanning the car's interior with practiced efficiency, but Regina could see the moment his eyes lingered on her briefcase in the back seat, the stack of policy manuals just visible inside. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Thompson asked, accepting her documents with one hand while the other still hovered near his belt. Regina noticed a slight tremor in his fingers, nervous energy, perhaps, or early morning coffee. "No, officer, I don't," she replied truthfully. "I've been very careful to observe all traffic laws." The morning birds continued their songs in the oak trees lining the street, creating an almost peaceful backdrop to this tense encounter. Thompson glanced at her license, then back at her face. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood. Mind telling me what brings you to this area?" Regina felt a familiar weight in her chest, not anger, but a deep, knowing sadness. How many times had she heard this same question posed to others? The suspicious activity that somehow always seemed to coincide with certain people driving through certain neighborhoods. "I'm on my way to work," she answered simply, watching his face for reaction. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows from the patrol car's light bar across her trunk. "And where would that be?" Martinez chimed in from the passenger side, his tone suggesting that her answer would determine the next phase of this encounter. A jogger passed by on the sidewalk, slowing to rubberneck at the scene. Regina caught the supple shake of their head, another witness to another routine traffic stop that didn't feel routine at all. "I'd prefer not to discuss my employment until you tell me the specific reason for this stop," Regina responded, her words measured and precise. She knew her rights, just as she knew exactly how this script usually played out. Thompson's posture stiffened slightly at her response. "Ma'am, we're just trying to ensure the safety of this neighborhood. There have been several incidents recently." Regina noticed how he let the sentence trail off, implying threats that didn't exist in any recent police reports. She checked them all last night. The morning had grown warmer, and a bead of sweat rolled down Thompson's temple. She wondered if it was from the heat or the growing realization that this stop might not have been as straightforward as he'd thought. "I understand, officer," she said, maintaining eye contact through his mirrored sunglasses. "And I appreciate your dedication to public safety. However, I'm still unclear about the specific traffic violation that prompted this stop." The radio on Thompson's shoulder crackled to life, dispatch starting their morning updates. Soon, they would run her license. Soon, this encounter would take a very different turn. Regina waited patiently, her hands still visible on the steering wheel, just as she'd done countless times before in her 20 years of law enforcement. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just experiencing another questionable traffic stop. She was gathering first-hand evidence of exactly what needed to change in her department. The weight of her badge in her purse felt heavier with each passing second. Officer Thompson held Regina's license and registration with a practiced grip, his eyes moving between the documents and her face. The morning had grown warmer, and cicadas had joined the birds in their morning chorus, creating nature's soundtrack to this tense encounter. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Thompson said, his tone shifting from merely professional to something harder. Regina recognized that tone. It was the voice of an officer who had already decided something was wrong, who was just looking for confirmation of their suspicions. "May I ask why that's necessary, officer?" Regina kept her voice calm and steady, though her mind was racing. This was exactly the kind of escalation she'd been studying in department reports, the moment when a routine stop became something more. Officer Martinez shifted his position slightly at the passenger window, his hand now resting more obviously on his belt. The sun caught his badge, sending a brief flash across Regina's rearview mirror. She noticed how young he looked, probably fresh from the academy, following his senior partner's lead without question. "Ma'am, when an officer gives you a lawful order, it's in your best interest to comply," Thompson said, using that familiar script that Regina had heard, and if she was honest, had used herself early in her career, too many times before. Regina nodded slowly. "I understand, officer. I'm going to unbuckle my seatbelt now." She narrated her movements clearly, just as she'd taught her own officers to appreciate. The click of the seatbelt seemed unusually loud in the morning quiet. As she opened her car door, Regina maintained her composure, though her heart was beating faster now. Not from fear. She'd been in far more dangerous situations, but from the weight of this moment. Everything happening now would become part of her plan for departmental reform. Standing on the pristine suburban sidewalk, Regina smoothed her blazer, noticing how Thompson's eyes flickered to her professional attire, then back to her face. A look of uncertainty crossed his features. Something wasn't fitting his preconceptions. "Where did you say you were headed?" Martinez asked from behind her, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced casualness that often preceded more pointed questioning. "I didn't say," Regina replied calmly. "And respectfully, officers, I'm still waiting to hear the specific reason for this stop." A morning jogger slowed their pace as they passed, poorly disguising their interest in the scene unfolding on their usually quiet street. Thompson's jaw tightened slightly. "We've had reports of suspicious vehicles in the area. Your presence here raised some concerns." "My presence?" Regina echoed, letting the words hang in the air. "Could you be more specific about what exactly about my presence seemed suspicious to you?" The officers exchanged a quick glance. Regina knew that look, the moment when they realized they might be stepping onto dangerous ground. A neighbor had come out to water their flowers, not even pretending not to watch the interaction. "Ma'am, your vehicle was observed moving slowly through the neighborhood," Thompson said, his confidence wavering slightly as he struggled to articulate a legitimate reason for the stop. "I was driving precisely 2 miles under the speed limit," Regina stated. "Is that considered suspicious behavior in this neighborhood?" She kept her tone professional but firm, watching as Thompson's expression shifted. The radio on Thompson's shoulder crackled to life. Regina knew what was coming. They were finally running her license. She could have mentioned her position right away, could have pulled out her badge and ended this immediately. But every moment of this stop was proving what she'd suspected about her department's practices. A child's laughter rang out from a nearby yard, the sound oddly jarring against the tension of the moment. Regina noticed how both officers instinctively glanced toward the sound, their training kicking in even in this situation. "While we wait for your information to clear," Thompson began, but Regina noticed his hand had moved away from his belt now. Something about her calm demeanor, her professional appearance, her articulate responses, it was making him second-guess his initial assumptions. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows on the perfectly manicured lawn beside them. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, such a peaceful backdrop for this moment of reckoning. Regina watched as Martinez shifted his weight uncomfortably. She'd seen that look before too, the gradual realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd made a mistake. The radio crackled again, and this time, Regina knew her information had come through. She could almost count down the seconds until everything changed. Thompson's face suddenly went pale as he listened to his earpiece. His posture changed instantly, that confident authority crumbling as the information came through. Martinez, noticing his partner's reaction, stepped forward slightly, confusion evident on his young face. The moment stretched out, filled only by the sound of distant lawnmowers and singing birds. Regina stood perfectly still waiting. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came in these moments of silence, in the space between realization and reaction. The morning air grew thick with tension as Officer Thompson's hand dropped from his belt, his whole demeanor transforming in an instant. The radio dispatch had just delivered news that would change everything. The woman they'd pulled over wasn't just any driver, she was their new chief of police. I apologize, Chief Washington, Thompson stammered, his face flushing red beneath his collar. The confident officer from moments ago had vanished, replaced by someone who looked very young and very uncertain. Behind him, Officer Martinez's eyes widened as he processed what was happening. Regina watched as realization dawned on their faces. The morning sun caught the sweat now beading on Thompson's forehead, and she could hear Martinez's boots scraping against the pavement as he shifted his weight nervously. A neighbor's sprinkler system clicked on nearby, its gentle rhythm a stark contrast to the tense silence. "At ease, officers," Regina said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. She reached into her purse and pulled out her badge, letting it catch the sunlight. "Though I would have preferred to meet you both under different circumstances." Thompson's hand shook slightly as he tried to return her license and registration. A passing school bus slowed down, curious children pressing their faces against the windows. Regina noted how this moment would ripple through the community, how stories would spread about what happened here this morning. "Chief, I can explain," Martinez started, but Regina held up a hand, silencing him. The morning breeze rustled through the oak trees lining the street, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and the weight of this teachable moment. "I think we all understand exactly what happened here," Regina said, her voice steady and clear. She gestured to the patrol car's dash camera. "Everything has been recorded just as it should be. Now we have perfect training material for our upcoming departmental review." Thompson's posture stiffened at the word training, and Regina could see the gears turning in his head as he realized the full implications of what had just occurred. The stop would be reviewed, analyzed, discussed. Their actions would become a case study. A delivery truck rumbled past, its driver slowing to take in the unusual scene, two officers looking increasingly uncomfortable while a well-dressed black woman stood calmly before them, clearly in control of the situation. Regina noticed how the officer's eyes followed the truck, probably wishing they could be anywhere else right now. "Chief Washington," Thompson began again, his voice steadier now, but heavy with realization, "we were responding to reports of suspicious." He stopped mid-sentence, finally hearing how those words sounded. Regina nodded slowly, letting the moment sink in. "Yes, Officer Thompson, please continue. What exactly made my presence in this neighborhood suspicious?" Her tone wasn't angry or accusatory, she didn't need it to be. The truth of the situation spoke loudly enough on its own. Martinez had removed his sunglasses, and Regina could see the confusion and shame in his young face. He'd probably never imagined his first encounter with his new chief would happen like this. A bird landed on a nearby fence, its morning song a reminder that life continued normally around them, even as these officers' world shifted beneath their feet. "I expect both of you in my office at 9 a.m. sharp," Regina said, checking her watch. "Bring your incident reports. We'll review them together, along with the dash cam footage." She paused, looking each officer in the eye. "This stop may not have gone as you planned, but it's going to be incredibly valuable for our department." The sound of another patrol car approaching made everyone turn. Word was spreading. Regina knew that by noon, every officer in the department would have heard about what happened here. Sometimes the most powerful messages came through actions rather than words. "For now, return to your patrol," she continued, her voice taking on a gentler tone. "And remember, every person you stop is someone's family member, someone's loved one, someone who deserves to be treated with respect regardless of where they're driving or what they look like." As she walked back to her car, Regina could hear Thompson and Martinez having a hushed conversation behind her. She caught fragments of words like "can't believe" and "what were we thinking." The morning sun was fully up now, casting her shadow long across the perfectly maintained suburban street. Starting her engine, Regina watched in her rearview mirror as the officers returned to their patrol car. They moved differently now, shoulders hunched, steps hesitant. They'd come looking for a suspicious driver and found their new chief instead. Sometimes, she thought, the best lessons were the ones you never saw coming. At exactly 9 a.m., Officers Thompson and Martinez stood nervously outside the chief's office. The morning's events had spread through the department like wildfire, and now every officer who passed by gave them sympathetic glances. The wooden bench they sat on had probably held countless others waiting to face consequences, but today it felt different. Regina sat at her desk, reviewing the dash cam footage one more time. She changed into her formal uniform now, stars on her collar catching the light from her office window. The morning's traffic stop played out on her screen in crisp detail, every assumption and misstep clearly documented. A gentle knock on her door broke the silence. "Come in," Regina called, her voice calm and professional. The two officers entered, their boots squeaking slightly on the polished floor. They stood at attention, faces forward, trying to maintain their composure. "At ease," Regina said, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. "Have a seat. We have a lot to discuss." She noticed how Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he handed over their incident reports, while Martinez couldn't quite meet her eyes. The office was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of phones ringing in the bullpen. Regina took her time, reading through their reports carefully. Each officer had documented the stop differently. Thompson focusing on suspicious behavior, Martinez noting community safety concerns. "I want you both to watch something," Regina said, turning her computer monitor so they could all see it. She played the dash cam footage, letting them experience the morning's events from an outside perspective. The silence in the room grew heavier as they watched themselves approach her car, their body language and tone now painfully obvious. "Stop right there," Regina said, pausing the video at a crucial moment. "Officer Thompson, what do you notice about your approach? About your hand position? About your tone of voice?" Her questions weren't accusatory. They were educational, designed to make him think. Thompson shifted in his seat, his uniform collar suddenly feeling too tight. I was operating on assumptions, Chief," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought. "You saw a black woman driving slowly through an affluent neighborhood," Regina finished for him. "And you made a series of decisions based on that single observation." She let the words hang in the air, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. Martinez spoke up, his young face earnest. "Chief, we were taught to look for anything out of the ordinary, anything that doesn't fit the neighborhood pattern." He stopped, suddenly hearing his own words through new ears. "And who decides what fits?" Regina asked quietly. "Who determines what's ordinary?" She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city they all served. The morning sun highlighted the diverse community going about their daily lives below. Turning back to them, she picked up a thick folder from her desk. "This contains traffic stop data from the past year. The patterns are clear, certain neighborhoods, certain demographics, certain assumptions being made over and over." She set the folder down with a gentle thud. "But today, we're going to start changing those patterns." Regina pressed play on the video again, letting it run to the moment of revelation when they discovered her identity. "Watch your faces," she instructed. "That moment of realization, that's what we need to examine, because the person you pulled over shouldn't have to be the chief of police to deserve respect and fair treatment." Thompson's shoulders slumped slightly. "We really messed up, didn't we, Chief?" The morning's bravado had been replaced by genuine reflection. "No," Regina replied, surprising them both. "You didn't mess up. You showed me exactly what needs to change. And now you're going to help me change it." She pulled out a new folder, this one empty except for a single sheet of paper. "This is our new community engagement initiative. You two are going to help design it." The officers exchanged confused looks. This wasn't the punishment they'd expected. Regina smiled, understanding their surprise. "The easy thing would be to write you up, put a reprimand in your files, and move on. But that wouldn't solve the real problem, would it?" She stood up and walked around her desk, sitting on its edge closer to them. "Instead, you're both going to spend the next month leading discussion groups with community members. You'll hear their stories, their experiences with law enforcement, and you'll share what you learned today." The tension in the room began to shift into something else. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Outside the office, the regular sounds of the police station continued, phones ringing, officers talking, the constant rhythm of a department serving its community. "Chief," Martinez started, then paused, gathering his thoughts. "I never thought. We were just doing what we thought was our job." "And that's exactly why this moment is so important," Regina replied. "Because now we get to redefine what that job really means. It's not about assumptions or suspicions. It's about protection and service for everyone equally. She handed each officer a fresh notebook. I want you to start documenting every traffic stop differently. Not just the what and where, but the why. Really examine your reasons. Question your assumptions. And remember, every person you pull over could be someone's mother, father, or yes, even their police chief. The morning light streamed through the office windows, casting long shadows across the desk. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in this room, a small but significant change was beginning to take root. 6 months had passed since that memorable morning traffic stop, and the Millbrook County Police Department looked different now. Not just on paper, but in the way officers carried themselves, in how they approached their daily duties, and most importantly, in how the community viewed them. Regina sat in her office, reviewing the latest community feedback reports. The morning sun streamed through her window, highlighting the new awards on her wall, recognition for innovative police reform and community engagement. But it wasn't the plaques that made her smile. It was the stack of letters from local residents describing positive interactions with her officers. A knock on her door drew her attention. Officers Thompson and Martinez entered, carrying their latest community engagement program results. They looked different now, more confident, but with a humility that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Their weekly community discussion groups had grown from reluctant meetings to standing room-only events. Chief Thompson said, placing a thick folder on her desk. We've completed the first round of neighborhood feedback sessions. His voice carried a pride that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with genuine accomplishment. Regina opened the folder, scanning the contents. Photographs showed officers and community members sitting together in living rooms, community centers, and local cafes. There were pages of notes, suggestions, and most importantly, stories of change perspectives from both sides of the badge. The Highland District meeting was particularly interesting, Martinez added, pulling out a specific report. Remember that neighbor who watched my traffic stop that morning? She's now leading our civilian advisory board. Says she never thought she'd be working with police, but here we are. Regina nodded, remembering that morning 6 months ago. The scene played out differently now across their jurisdiction. Traffic stops were down by 40%, but community trust was up by even more. Officers were trained to question their assumptions, to look deeper than their first impressions. Tell me about the youth program, Regina said, turning to a new page in the report. This was Thompson's special project, something he'd developed after realizing how his own preconceptions had been shaped early in his career. It's making a real difference, Chief, Thompson replied, his face lighting up. We've got kids from every neighborhood joining our junior police academy. But it's not just about showing them how to be officers, it's about teaching them to be bridge builders in their own communities. The sound of laughter drifted in from the hallway. The department's break room had become a place where officers and community members often gathered for coffee and conversation. The walls between us and them were slowly coming down. Regina stood and walked to her window, looking out over the city she'd sworn to protect and serve. Below, she could see one of her patrol units stopped at a crosswalk, the officer chatting with an elderly woman as he helped her across the street. Simple moments like these were becoming the norm rather than the exception. We've got the quarterly stats ready too, Martinez said, pulling out another report. Use of force incidents are down 70%. Civilian complaints have dropped by more than half. And our response times have actually improved now that we're not making unnecessary stops. Regina turned back to her officers, seeing in them the change she'd hoped to inspire. That morning traffic stop could have ended differently, with reprimands, defensive posturing, and unchanged attitudes. Instead, it had become the catalyst for real transformation. You know what the best part is? Thompson said, gesturing to the community feedback forms. People are starting to wave at us again. Kids don't run away when we drive through the neighborhoods. Yesterday, someone actually thanked me for pulling them over, said they appreciated how I explained everything and treated them with respect. The morning sun caught Regina's chief's badge as she returned to her desk. She picked up one of the thank you letters. This one from a mother whose son had been inspired to become an officer after attending one of Thompson's youth programs.